Hello, friends. Welcome. Welcome. Lots of friends here with us. I'm Shehn. I am one of the deputy campaign directors for All on the Line. So we're just going to give it one more minute. We'll get started at 8:06 Eastern Time. All right, just give it a couple more minutes. See some friendly names here. It's good to see lots of friends. I see my mom. That's not embarrassing. Mom came to hang out with me. All right, it is 8:06 on the East Coast. Again, I'm Shehn Datta. I'm one of the deputy campaign directors for the All on the Line campaign. I wanted to welcome all of you to join us for this conversation. We're here with Ari Berman. So Ari, I also want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this exciting conversation about the state of democracy. So welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce Ari. Ari, I know you from this book, Give Us The Ballot, which I don't know if you'll recognize this program. It is several years old. It's been in my book since I got it at the launch of your book, August 13th. I don't even know what year it was. It was the year that the VRA turned 50.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah, that's a throwback.
It is. It's from the Busboys and Poets event on 14th Street. I went when I was a staffer. God knows where I was working at the time, but I remember thinking that day that voting rights still continues to be what wakes me up in this morning every day. It's what I think about, and I think it's what you think about every day as well. So for folks who don't know Ari is a political correspondent for The Nation, an investigative journalism fellow with the Nation Institute. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and Rolling Stones, and he frequently comments on MSNBC and NPR. Some of you may have read his book. I'm going to just show it one more time, Give Us the Ballot. And that's actually why we are just here today. We were going to talk about voting rights. And the reason why we at the National Redistricting Action Fund and All on the Line care so much about voting rights is that it is seminal for moving forward the conversation about fighting gerrymandering. Gerrymandering goes hand in hand with its impact on all sorts of issues that we all wake up and care about. For me, like I said, it's voting rights. For some of you, it might be climate change. It might be access to abortion. It might be healthcare and access to healthcare. So that's why we're here. That's what we're going to talk about. So welcome. So Ari, one of the things that I just wanted to ask you about is what drew you to studying and writing about voting rights? It's such a nuanced and niche issue, but what was the thing that brought you in and said, this is what I want to talk about every day?
Hey, Shehn, well, thank you for having me. And one quick correction to the bio. I'm now a senior reporter at Mother Joe's. I'm no longer with The Nation. But everything else.
I'm so sorry. That's right. I keep emailing.
Honestly, so I mean, I'd like to sort of be able to say that voting rights was something that I had thought about my entire life, but I think it was something that the right to vote was sort of something that I took for granted for a long time. And the way I started covering it was after the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from blue to red, really pivotal swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and North Carolina. We saw in a very short period of time all of these new restrictions on voting being introduced. Things like new voter ID laws and cutbacks to early voting and closing polling places and purging the voting rolls. And this is stuff that I think is fairly well known now, but back then it wasn't getting any coverage. And I noticed that all of these states that were really important had changed their voting laws, seemingly in response to the first Black president. And the issue wasn't really getting any attention. And so I wrote my first piece about voting rights in Rolling Stone all the way back in August of 2011. And it was called The GOP War on Voting. And I thought maybe I'd write one piece and go back to this, but it ended up being something that I was really passionate about. And then, as you mentioned, in 2013, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. I became very interested in the history of the Voting Rights Act. That led me to write my book, Give Us the Ballot, about the history of voting rights since 1965. And then from there, I just kind of got deeper and deeper into the subject, both from a journalist perspective, but also because I was just really interested in the history and the intersection of the fights for voting rights back in the 1960s and the fights for voting rights today. Because I think a lot of people think that these issues are settled. And the fact is they've never been settled, but they're especially unsettled today.
Yeah, I think that's why there's so many people who are on this call with us today, because we feel so unsettled, but I think we can't talk about what's happening today until we talk about what's happened in the past. And you sort of touched on it, which was the response to the election of the first Black president, which in 2008 was when I started doing voting rights work. I was actually an organizer on his campaign, and I was actually registering voters. And I was in North Carolina for the majority of the cycle, and just remembered seeing like the barriers that existed in 2008, and then going back in 2012 when I was working there again, and seeing how much had shifted in the like access to the ballot, which is daunting. And it was, a 4-year period that so much had shifted. At the time, I just was someone on the ground. I didn't step back and like think about what had really happened. And you actually talk about it in your book, where you said like with the Tea Party's triumph in 2010, like half the states, most of which were under Republican control, passed laws restricting the right to vote. 395 new voting restrictions were passed in those few years between 2011 and 2015. And so like that's where we were then. But I just want to think about like since the Trump election in 2016. Has this continued to be a push that legislators are pushing, or is it something that they've stepped back from and are sort of just letting fight as it does in the courts, for example?
No, I think it's very clear that the Republican Party has doubled down on voter suppression, particularly in the wake of Trump's election. And I think what was motivating restrictions on voting from the very beginning was a desire to really try to nullify the election of the first Black president and to try to shape an electorate that would be older, whiter, more conservative, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive, and to try to shut new voices, more diverse communities out of the political process. And I think that helps explain why someone like Trump has been elected in the first place. I think it explains how the Republican Party is trying to hold on to power in the Trump era. I mean, you just look at what's happening now. Trump opposing vote by mail, even though he himself voted by mail. In Texas, they're trying to say that anyone under 65 can't use coronavirus as a reason why they should be able to vote by mail. So we're seeing lots of rhetoric about the prevalence of voter fraud, even though voter fraud is a very small problem in American elections. So I think the Republican Party, unfortunately, continues to be committed to making it harder for people to vote. Now, I will say, since I started covering this issue, there's been a big pushback in terms of trying to protect voting rights. There's been some really tangible court victories. There's a lot of new organizations out there, including yours, that are working on this issue. People care about it a lot more. So I think when someone tries to do something bad now, there's a lot more attention on it than there was before. I mean, but you just have to look at what happened in Wisconsin in April to see that voter suppression is far from over.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what happened in Wisconsin just like hits home so deeply. And when we have to balance the right to vote with the right to our lives and our safety and I can't even, I get a little fired up and emotional. And like usually it steers towards anger when I think about it, but and usually some bad words associated with that. But it's something that is interesting to me is when we juxtapose what's been happening on the right, for example, and like the attempts to suppress the right to vote with the passage of HR 1, for example, which passed in 2019 when we flipped the US House. HR 1, of course, expanded access to democratic norms, be it voting rights or campaign finance reform. What are we saying? Like, how can you frame those against each other? Is this like a left versus right issue? Is it more that like, is it a question of who, like expansion of the electorate? What like, is it that nuanced, or like, is it more nuanced, or is it that simple of a framing?
Well, I really would hope that it wouldn't be a left versus right issue, that it wouldn't be a Democratic Republican issue. I mean, in an ideal world, we would just admit that everyone should have the ability to vote, and we would argue about policy. That's natural, but we would not argue about who gets to vote in the first place. But unfortunately, it has become a partisan issue, and I think that in response to Republicans making it harder to vote, Democrats have belatedly gotten more serious about making it easier to vote, which I think is really important. I think it was really significant that the first major piece of legislation introduced in the House and passed shortly thereafter was a sweeping democracy reform bill that would make it a lot easier to vote, would make it a lot harder to buy elections, a lot harder to corrupt the political process. I mean, I think that was a statement by House Democrats that this isn't their top priority. And if you don't reform the democratic process, it's going to be very difficult to do anything else. And I think that's one of the reasons, for example, why Attorney General Holder is so passionate about this issue, because I think he realizes that if the political system is rigged, it's going to be a lot harder to fight for against climate change, or for a woman's right to choose, or for a higher minimum wage, or for immigration reform, or for all these things that people care about. Because if one party has a lock on power, they're not going to be open to any sort of new ideas.
No, that's absolutely true. And he talks about shifting the balance of power and making access to power more accessible. And it's funny because he has this great sense of humor about how we bring change about in a healthy way, in a way that encourages discourse and dialogue. And it's funny that you mentioned him, because I was actually thinking about how we've gone from these landmark pieces of legislation, i.e. like the Voting Rights Act or HR 1, and then how Attorney General Holder has been so like negatively connected with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. As a human being who cares so much about it, to then see him say like, oh, well, now my name is tied to Shelby County v. Holder. And I've actually heard him in the past say like, I just call it Shelby County. Like, let's not stick my name onto the end of it. Which, you know, is using humor to deflect some of it. But you talk about it in the book a little bit, and you say that, and it, like, as someone who studied the law, that the Roberts Court, sorry, hold on, I'm a little bit, Johnny, can you help us? There we go. Thanks so much. That
maybe the Russians are on the call too.
I know. I was like, there they are. They start talking about the Attorney General, and here they are. They're like, oh, we recognize that. So how did his court use like previously established laws and precedent to come to their decision in Shelby County v. Holder, basically gutting Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, eliminating preclearance, and making it easier for groups and legislators to take away the right to vote?
Yeah, so I mean, in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And I think the first really important thing to know about the decision is that it was authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, who had been trying for 30 years to try to weaken the Voting Rights Act. And I tell that story in my book, that ever since Roberts was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, he had been trying to weaken the power of the Voting Rights Act. So it's not like John Roberts woke up one day and was like, oh, we've solved the problem of voting discrimination. We don't need the Voting Rights Act. His elevation to the Supreme Court was indicative of how the anti-voting rights movement had succeeded, and how things they had been trying to do and failing to do for a long time, like weaken the Voting Rights Act, were suddenly possible. And the other important thing to know about the decision was that it invoked a very dangerous legacy, in my view, of states' rights, which had long been used to justify white supremacy. I mean, you go all the way back to before the Civil War, to the Dred Scott decision, which said that African Americans couldn't even be citizens of the United States, whether they were free or enslaved. They cannot be citizens. And there was something in that court decision that said that basically making African American citizens would violate the equal sovereignty of the states. And that was the same phrase that John Roberts used in Shelby County versus Holder, that the Voting Rights Act violated the equal sovereignty of the states. Now, I'm not saying John Roberts agrees with Dred Scott, but I'm saying that there's a long line of decisions invoking states' rights to justify white supremacy. that helps get you to a position where 5 justices on the court would vote to invalidate the heart of the most important civil rights law in this country?
It's I think every day in the work that I do with All on the Line about the differences in states, and like how one state's laws are so different but so similar to another state's laws, and we see it like every day for me with redistricting, and like how redistricting laws, for example, are so nuanced. I talk about this in a lot of our trainings with All on the Line volunteers as we go out and talk about redistricting, that the process is so murky. It's intentionally murky to keep people away, so that it's harder for them to say, like, let me go talk to my legislator about like why drawing lines a certain way keeps me from accessing true representation. But how do you talk to your legislator? How do you know who's actually drawing maps? I like when I was younger, it was like, oh, it's like crayons on a piece of butcher paper, and then you're like, oh no, it's smoke-filled back rooms. But the use of redistricting to continue to keep folks from accessing power. In Give Us a Ballot, you talk about this a little bit. You say racial gerrymandering, the 1991-1992 redistricting process, created and formed majority-minority districts that led to Republican success in 1994 when Republicans picked up 54 seats. I mean, sure, we're talking about 20 plus years ago, but like the impact of it is still seen now. I mean, we saw it again in 2011 with Project Red Map, which was more systematic, and we talked about it more. But can you talk a little bit about the ramifications of gerrymandering on governing? Like, what is what does it lead to?
I think voter suppression and gerrymandering are two sides of the same coin, and they're really complementary tactics. What you're doing with voter suppression is you're trying to shut people out of the political process to get a desired outcome. And what you're doing with gerrymandering is once you gain power, you're trying to prevent anyone from ever taking it away from you through the political process. So, I mean, there are two different ways of trying to fix an election. And I mean, gerrymandering is another one of those issues that I think was not very well understood, that has gotten a lot more attention. People are a lot more passionate about. People see the ramifications of it. But in virtually every state where Republicans have done really bad gerrymandering, they've also passed really bad voter suppression laws as well. And it's really an attempt by one party to try to rig the democratic process. And I always go back to Wisconsin, where the legislature there won 46% of the vote in 2018, but got 64% of seats. And so they basically are thinking, we're going to win no matter what people think. And I think that's why you get to a situation where they say to people in last April that you have to vote in person, where even though it's a pandemic, we're not going to mail ballots to every registered voter. They believe that basically they are insulated from democratic accountability. Now, I think if enough people vote, they can overcome these structural hurdles. If enough people get out and vote, they can overcome the impact of voter suppression. They can overcome the impact of gerrymandering. But it makes it a lot harder to begin with, to have accountability in the democratic process when people are trying to fix the rules to their advantage.
Yeah, and you talk about this election in April, and I think a lot of us were still shocked that we flipped that, or like that Supreme Court seat went to a progressive candidate, because I think we assumed, okay, well, if they're suppressing our access to the ballot, maybe like they're going to actually achieve their goals and making sure that that seat is Republican held or conservative held, because supposedly it's a nonpartisan race. But I think the shock that was felt in Wisconsin, and you mentioned 2018, and you've got a state where governorship flips from very red to pretty blue, and like the lieutenant governorship as well. But when you see the legislature, nothing changed. I think, in fact, we lost a state Senate seat that had been won in a special election previously in the year. And so it's something that we think about. But as someone who wakes up and thinks about voting rights a lot, 2021 will be the first time that across the country, I mean, sure, some states have redrawn maps, Virginia, for example, North Carolina, but this is the first time that maps will be drawn since Section 5 was gutted. And so how do you think this is going to actually impact redistricting? And for a lot of us, especially people on this call, can this be a rallying cry for us to move around?
Yeah, so first off, on Wisconsin, I think it's really important to remember that voter suppression doesn't always work. And sometimes it backfires and it pisses people off and it makes them more motivated to vote. And I think by what Wisconsin Republicans did, refusing to postpone that election, made a lot more people aware of a state Supreme Court race that they may have not been paying attention to. It may have made them more motivated to be able to vote. So I think sometimes voter suppression can have a rallying cry of making people more mobilized. And hopefully that's one of the lessons coming out of Wisconsin. In terms of no Section 5, what it means is that those states with the longest histories of discrimination, they're going to be able to draw their maps in 2021 without having to approve them with the federal courts and the Justice Department. So I would fully imagine that in those states, particularly in Republican control, like Texas or Georgia, places like that, they're going to try to see what they can get away with. And they're going to try to make this process even more secretive and even more discriminatory. And that's why I think citizen involvement is going to be even more critical. Because before you could kind of say, oh, we'll rely on the Justice Department, we'll rely on the courts. Now I don't think you can say that anymore. And so really, I think people have to demand accountability from the very beginning of the process and get involved. And I think one of the good things that emerged from what happened in 2011, when they drew some of these maps in secret, was nobody was paying attention to them at that point. It just totally got swept under the rug. In 2021, hopefully, people are going to be paying a lot more attention to what legislators do, and it's going to make it harder for them to try to get away with the kind of stuff that they pulled a decade ago, because their ability to manipulate the maps will probably be even more sophisticated this time without the Strong Voting Rights Act, and also with technology getting more sophisticated. So that's the scary proposition. But the good thing is that there are more organizations now paying attention to this. People care more about it, and it's harder for legislators to get away with the kind of power grabs that they pulled after 2010.
One of the states that this conversation has made me think about so much is Florida. And Florida, I'm not trying to pick on this state. Let's preface it with that. But in 2012, they redrew their maps, having just passed amendments 5 and 6, which the Fair Districts Amendment said, like, where you can't draw maps with any partisan intent or to favor a single particular party or sort of dilute the vote power of any, or like representation power of any racial organization, like community. And then, we've seen the courts in Florida upheld those decisions and said that maps drawn in 2012 and 2015 in Florida were done with intent to favor a specific party. But we've now lost the Florida Supreme Court. That court no longer is composed in the same way. And so when we think about that pre-clearance access and what do we do when we don't have access to the courts through which we can see ramification? What are our options at this point?
Well, I think in a bunch of states, you can still go to court in the state. So some states are going to have better Supreme Court, some states are going to have worse state courts. But that is something that's available, even though the Supreme Court, which was a really insane decision, in my opinion, said that the federal courts can't review partisan gerrymandering. You can still strike down racial gerrymandering. That is still unconstitutional. One thing that we saw in 2018, which was that 5 states passed ballot initiatives to try to curb gerrymandering, which was really significant because I think it showed strong bipartisan support for doing this. Now, Republicans are in the process of trying to unwind some of that in Missouri, for example. But I think the average voter, whether they're a Democrat or Republican, doesn't like gerrymandering. And I think that's obvious because we saw anti-gerrymandering ballot initiatives pass in Utah, pass in Missouri, pass in places that are pretty red. And so this is not just like a Democratic versus Republican issue. This is something that I think most people on an average level realize is wrong. And so I think there's a big opening for citizen involvement, whether it's trying to do it through ballot initiative or trying to do it through legislation, to try to take gerrymandering out of the hands of politicians. Like Michigan, for example, a really important swing state, is going to do all of their redistricting now through a citizens commission in 2022. And so that's going to be really, really important. And that's going to show that there's another way forward. And hopefully there'll be more pressure on more states to adopt reforms like that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, especially when you talk about Missouri, that now, here are these sweeping, like this reform that everyone is so excited about, clean Missouri and like clean, like redraws of maps, and clean redistricting was there. And now, as we like to call it, it's dirty Missouri, because the legislature has now said, whoa, that's crazy. And they're fighting back, and they're trying to repeal this ballot measure and say that like the laws that were passed don't hold. And I think it goes back once again to like holding on to that grip of power and saying like, this is ours, you can't take it away from us. But it's, once again, legislators drawing their own maps. They're not picking, the voters aren't picking their politicians are therefore picking their voters.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding what happened. It's pretty astounding what happened in Missouri, that 62% of voters there supported a independent redistricting process. And the legislature just said, no, we don't agree. And we want you to actually vote again on this and repeal it. Now, that's a crazy power grab. The good news is that voters can just vote it down, though. And they can reject what the legislature is trying to do. And I think they will reject it because it had strong support in the first place. And also a number of Republicans there said this was a very flawed and undemocratic process. But I mean, it just shows to show you how threatened some people feel by a fair political process, that you feel like the only way you can win is if you are able to hold on to power by any means necessary. And if there was a fair, independent process, that would threaten your livelihood. I mean, that is very indicative of the views of some people in one political party in particular right now.
Yeah, that hold on, I think, is a little bit scary. And you look at governors, secretaries of states, election administrators at the local or the county level across the country. Specifically, I'm thinking about in like conservative and swing states who are still restricting access to the ballot today. You talked about it, like nothing's changed from 1965 when we talk about vote riders who like tried to, and freedom riders who were down in the South trying to register voters, and they were fighting back against poll taxes. And I think that still exists today. I mean, we talk about poll tax in Florida and in Georgia, and then we're coming back to voter roll purges over and over again. I know that in Ohio, it's something that's come up so many times. Like, how many times can we purge the voter rolls? Like, what can we do at this point? What can an everyday person, besides constantly, like, I say, like, okay, you have to constantly check. It's on the voter to then say, oh, let me go check my registration again. Let me make sure I'm still registered to vote. But what can we do systematically to sort of fight back against this voter suppression?
Well, I think it's really important that people pay attention to local offices. I think so much the attention is on the presidency, and now it's so much of the attention is at Donald Trump, and that's really important. But one thing that we're seeing in the midst of coronavirus is who your local reps are is extremely important. And so who the governor is, when it comes to elections, who the Secretary of State is, who are running local election boards. A lot of decisions are made by local election officials. So I would urge everyone not just to vote in those races, but to get involved. Get involved with your local election board. Get involved at that level. Because, I mean, honestly, a lot of the decisions in 2020 are going to be made at the local level, particularly when it comes to things like vote by mail. And so this election is going to be totally different than any other election because so many more people are going to vote by mail than they did before. And that's going to bring up a whole new set of concerns. And so, for example, in Wisconsin, so many volunteers had to help people cast absentee ballots who had never done it before, because only 6% of Wisconsinites cast absentee ballots in 2018. 60% cast absentee ballots in April. So that's an unbelievable increase from 6 to 60% in one election cycle. And so, like, what can an average person do? Like, help people figure out how to request an absentee ballot. A lot of people don't even understand how to do that. Help people understand when to send your ballot back. Help people to understand what you need to do to get that ballot counted. Some states like Wisconsin have crazy rules. Like, you need a witness signature on your ballot. or you have to upload a copy of your ID with your ballot. So I think there's a lot of room for everyday people to help people vote, particularly in this election compared to all previous ones, because so many people are going to need help voting now in a way that they maybe didn't if you just said, okay, go to your polling place.
Yeah, I love that. Of course, in my doomsday scenario brain, because I read a lot of dystopia and like a lot of I read things like your book or the news where we've seen like, okay, well, we passed this great reform and now we're going to find a way to just take it away. And I think about Arizona. Arizona has the permanent early vote list where if you're on Pebble, you'll get an it's basically vote by mail. It's existed for many, many years. And in 2017 or 2018, I want to say, I'm losing track of dates, the legislature tried to say, okay, Pebble seems to be working really well for some specific communities. And like, they don't look like us here in the legislature. So what we should do is keep groups that are on the ground from collecting, from picking up those ballots and being able to collect them at once and turn them in for members of our community. Do you think that's gonna, if in the best of scenarios, we've actually passed vote by mail in every state or made vote by mail accessible, do you think that there will be laws that Republicans or the right tries to pass to say like, whoop, nope, that's done. You have to turn in your own ballot. Like, do you think this is going to be something that we head towards in the future?
Well, vote by mail is already a political battleground. We're already seeing so many legal fights over how people can access vote by mail, and a lot of states are not making the process easy. What I would like to see is that every state just send voters a ballot. I mean, that's what Oregon does, that's what Washington does, that's what Utah does, that's what Colorado does, that's what Hawaii does. That's the simplest way. If you're registered to vote, you get a ballot in the mail. California said they're going to do that in 2020. So that's the gold standard, and I think people should push their states to do that. Second to that is send everyone absentee ballot applications in the mail. So at the very least, you can get the form and then fill it out. That's what Michigan's going to do. So I think that's the easiest way to do it. What I worry about are all the small details that can be really confusing to people. Like I mentioned, you need a witness signature on your ballot at a time of social distancing, or you need to upload your ID, or people forget to sign their absentee ballot, or they forget to sign the outside of the ballot, and your ballot's not counted. I mean, so there's going to have to be a lot of voter education between now and then for people that understand the process to help people vote by mail. I don't think we can just assume that people understand how to vote by mail like they understand how to go vote at a polling place. Because in the last election, only a quarter of Americans voted by mail. So 75% of the country is not unfamiliar with voting by mail. And I think it's the safest way to vote in a pandemic. I don't think it should be the only way to vote. I think we need to have safe in-person options because there are some people that distrust voting by mail. There are reasons why it's inaccessible for communities, for example, that don't get good mail service, like, for example, Native American reservations. But I think that vote by mail is critical, and I also think that's one reason why it's critical to pay attention to what the Trump administration is trying to do to the post office. I don't think it's a coincidence that in an election in which vote by mail is going to be bigger than ever before, the Trump administration is trying to defund the very institution that delivers those mail ballots to people. So, I mean, I think that the post office is something that people really need to keep an eye on. And I think people need to say to Congress, to their local officials, we support the post office. And again, this is not a Democratic versus Republican issue. Republicans get mail too. And so, I mean, I don't know why the post office has suddenly become a partisan issue when it's something that literally every person, regardless of their political affiliation, relies on.
No, it's something that we see. I live in Arlington County, Virginia. I was walking my dog yesterday and happened to walk by the courthouse, and I looked to the left for some odd reason, and I noticed that they have vote by mail applications pinned to the outside of their door, which you can hand, like there's a little mail drop slot right there. And I think that counties, this goes back to what you were saying, are trying to make this a little bit easier. I also obviously live in Arlington County, Virginia, which is a little bit more blue leaning. My election administrator probably here in the county is a little bit more comfortable with encouraging vote by mail, encouraging safer voting standards and practices. But I do love the shout out that like states like Oregon and Colorado, so Oregon and Washington have vote by mail. Colorado, I know there's a lot of progressive groups on the ground who say like, we're Colorado, like things are great here. We have vote centers where people can go just drop off their ballot. We also have vote by mail, but they're also thinking about what they can do better. Progressive groups in Colorado just a couple of weeks ago submitted a letter to all their county clerks saying these are ways that you can practice social distancing during the time of voting. And I like to think that even when you're the best, you continue to try to reform things and make things a little bit better. And so I'm trying to shift us to like a happier note. I don't want to end our conversation on such like those downer points, but at least in the last 3 months, we've seen two states that I like to think about in a negative, like Wisconsin and Ohio. We've been talking about Wisconsin, botched their primaries. So can you highlight any good stories about like successful primaries that have happened, and how can we mirror those? Like, is it just the reliance on vote by mail, or are there other things that you're like, we should just try to move towards those if we can?
I think that's a good question. States that have held their primaries largely by mail, that have done this before, did them without any problems. I think the Colorado example, I think, is really instructive, not just for the primary, but just in the way their system works, which is that they send every voter a ballot, but you can also vote easily in person if you want to. And they have election day registration. So if you're not registered to vote, you can show up at the polls and register on election day. And that fusion system of making it easy to vote by mail and making it easier to vote in person, there was just a study that found out that Colorado has been dramatically able to boost turnout among younger voters, among communities of color, by making voting easier compared to other states that have not made voting as easy. And so I think, you know, we have models out there about what can work and what has worked in the primaries, but also what works in normal times as well. And so I think that basically we just need to look at this from a less political perspective and more from an expert perspective of these are the states that are doing well and this is what you should emulate. Now, the really important thing is that this can't be done overnight, and that states need to start making these changes now. And so Congress allocated $400 million in federal funding for the states. No one believes that's enough money. The House last Friday passed a $3.6 billion bill in funding for states to be able to do vote by mail, to be able to open enough polling places, to be able to do early voting so people can social distance at the polls. That hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Mitch McConnell, I'm sure, will oppose it in the Senate. So I think, again, that needs to be a big issue that's not overlooked. I know there's so much going on right now, but people need to pay attention to what's happening in their states and what's happening in Congress, because you can't just wake up in October and say, I want my state to be able to send every registered voter a ballot. I mean, these decisions are starting to be made now. And so the pressure has to be put on politicians, both at the federal and the state level now, to make these changes, or we're not going to be able to make them in November.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. Like, we have to start fighting right now. And Ari's not a plant for everyone on the call, but All on the Line does have a call out tool. So you can contact your member in the Senate and say, like, we want you to vote yes on the HEROES Act. So something that we can do from the All on the Line standpoint is make sure that that tool gets out to everyone. It's a quick phone call. It's a tweet to your senator to say, like, please vote and ask Mitch McConnell to call this to a vote, because this is what we have to do. So Ari, we're about to close here, but I have one last ask of you. Can you tell us like one anecdote about democracy that serves to inspire you every day? We've talked about like, oh, those are like really bad things that have happened in the history of voting rights and democracy, but like, what's something that you think about that sort of gives you hope and joy? Not to quote President Obama here or anything, but.
I mean, I always go back to thinking about Congressman John Lewis. And I mean, he's a personal hero of mine. I know he's a personal hero of many people on this call. Someone that I write a lot about in my book. And I mean, I just think about the fact that, you know, he nearly died marching to pass the Voting Rights Act in Selma, Alabama. And he didn't give up. He didn't give up then. And after the Voting Rights Act was passed, he didn't say, okay, this landmark law that I almost died for is passed. I can move on. He was holding the gavel in the House when the House passed H.R. 1 last year, 50-something years later, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he's still involved in this fight. And so I think it's really, really important to remember that these kind of changes don't happen overnight, and that the fight for voting rights is a long-term struggle. And we'd like to believe that this fight is over, but it's not over. And if John Lewis can do this for 55 years, then I think the rest of us can do it for as long as it takes until everyone has access to be able to cast a ballot. So that's really, I mean, there's so many inspirational stories, but I just think John Lewis, to me, and I know there's a documentary coming out on him later this year that I'm really excited about, but that to me is just a sign of the commitment that you need to this issue, and the fact that if he hasn't lost hope, if he's not bitter, if he still believes that change is possible, then we all should too.
Okay, well, now I'm teary-eyed, and I'm probably going to go reread March, because if anyone hasn't read Congressman Lewis's, it's sort of like it's a graphic novel autobiography of the march in Selma, and it absolutely brings me to tears. And so, Ari, I love that, like, one of my heroes is also one of your heroes. That brings me a little bit of joy tonight. So I want to thank you so much for joining us for this conversation tonight. Thank you for sort of imparting your wisdom about, like, this is what we can do to fight for a fair democracy that is protected and it's safe in November. And I can't thank you enough for joining us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shehn. Great to talk to you, and keep up the good work. And I know we'll talk again soon.
Definitely. Thank you. We'll talk soon. Thanks, Ari.
Bye.
And thank
Have
you
a good
all
night,
for
guys.
joining. Have a great night. Thank you.